It was August 18, 1942, and the Japanese forces were about to make a move that they believed would secure them victory. Led by Colonel Kona Ichiki, their mission was simple: capture Guadalcanal, reclaim Henderson Field, and crush the American forces in the Pacific. They were confident. They believed they were facing an army of soft, inexperienced soldiers who would be no match for their battle-hardened veterans. After all, the Japanese had already dominated much of Asia. How could a small group of American Marines stop them? But the Japanese were about to face something they hadn't prepared for, something that would destroy their beliefs about warfare and change the course of history. The Marines on Guadalcanal weren't the soft, ill-prepared soldiers the Japanese expected. They were tough, trained for jungle warfare and equipped with superior firepower. And that night, the Americans were about to show them exactly what they were made of. But before I go any further, let me ask you, are you interested in more untold stories of military history? The kind of stories they don't teach in school? If you're enjoying this so far, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell. Trust me, you don't want to miss the rest of this incredible tale. Now, back to the story. Colonel Ichiki had come to Guadalcanal with a fierce belief in the Japanese warrior spirit. He knew his men were elite fighters, trained for the most brutal of combat, and he was certain that his force would crush the Americans, who he thought were unprepared and weak. His exact words to his officers were, "We will sweep them into the sea before sunrise." Confidence ran high, and Ichiki was ready for a quick, decisive victory. But what Ichiki didn't know was that the Americans on Guadalcanal were about to show him that war isn't won on courage alone. This wasn't going to be the easy victory he envisioned. His well-trained soldiers were about to face something much bigger: American firepower, superior logistics, and the brutal realities of jungle warfare. And they had no idea what they were up against. The environment itself would become the first weapon the Americans used. The thick, tangled jungle that had once favored the Japanese would now become a graveyard for their troops. The American forces weren't just fighting with their weapons, they were fighting with preparation, coordination, and the environment on their side. By August 7th, the U.S. Marines had landed at Lunga Point, beginning what would turn into a battle for survival in one of the harshest environments imaginable. The goal was simple: seize the airfield, establish a defensive perimeter, and hold it until reinforcements arrived. But the reality of the situation was far more complicated. The island was a nightmare of tropical heat, humidity, and swarms of mosquitoes. It felt like everything was working against them. But the Marines had one thing the Japanese didn't anticipate: resilience. Now, let me ask again, if you think these untold stories of the Pacific War are incredible, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. These are the stories you won't hear anywhere else, and by subscribing, you'll always be the first to know when a new chapter in history drops. The Marines' first big break came on August 8th, when the airfield, later known as Henderson Field, was almost completely unprotected. The Japanese had expected to hold the airfield, but they had abandoned it in haste when they saw the American troops moving in. Engineers worked quickly to complete the runway, and soon, American aircraft were landing. This would be the turning point. But the Japanese weren't going to let go that easily. They had plans to retake the field and crush the American foothold in the Pacific. The next night, the Japanese launched a surprise attack. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa led a brilliant nighttime strike through the darkness, sinking 4 heavy cruisers and claiming one of the worst defeats in U.S. naval history. The Americans lost over 1,000 sailors, and the Marines were now cut off, stranded on Guadalcanal with no backup and few supplies. The situation was looking grim. But the Marines weren't done yet. The Japanese command, desperate to retake Henderson Field, failed to grasp one crucial fact. Control of that airfield meant control of the surrounding seas during daylight. The Americans had air superiority, and that would be their ace in the hole. While the Japanese dominated the night, the Marines held the skies. And they weren't just defending, they were setting up for their next move. This is where the true nature of the battle began to unfold. The Americans had something the Japanese didn't expect: superior coordination and the ability to outlast their enemies. The Japanese believed in their warrior spirit and their ability to win in close combat, but they soon learned that courage alone couldn't overcome the industrial strength, firepower, and logistics that the Americans brought to the table. The jungle, which had once been their ally, would betray them. Now, before we dive deeper into this intense battle, make sure you've subscribed to the channel. If you're enjoying the drama, the strategy, and the sheer determination on both sides, this is the place for you. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The Japanese forces, after being knocked back by the Marines, launched yet another offensive. This time they knew it would take more than just brute force. They needed to outthink the Americans. But what they didn't know was that the Americans had already adapted, making their defenses almost impenetrable. The Japanese soldiers, already demoralized by their early losses, were about to face even more adversity. And it would come from a source they never expected: the American use of firepower and superior logistics. The night was far from over, but the Japanese were already feeling the weight of their mistakes. As dawn broke over the Guadalcanal battlefield on August 21st, it revealed a horrifying scene. Nearly 800 dead soldiers from Colonel Ichiki's detachment scattered across the sandbar. The assault had failed miserably. The Marines had fought back with a ferocity the Japanese hadn't expected, and now they had a deadly understanding of what they were up against. These weren't the soft Americans they had envisioned. They were soldiers, and they were ready to fight for every inch of ground. The Japanese had thought they could crush the Americans with their superior close combat tactics and warrior spirit. But in the light of day, the Marines' defenses were still standing strong. The Japanese attack, which had seemed so certain, had been met with a devastating response. It was as if the Marines were prepared for this exact moment, as though they knew what was coming. And they did. The American forces had spent weeks preparing for this very scenario. But here's the thing. This wasn't just about raw combat. The Japanese forces were not prepared for what was about to hit them: overwhelming firepower. The American defense was built on systems that worked together seamlessly. Machine guns positioned perfectly, artillery that could hit targets within minutes, and air support that dominated the skies. This wasn't a war of individual glory. This was industrial warfare, where firepower, logistics, and coordination were the true keys to victory. And what was the reaction of the Japanese forces when they saw this in action? Shock. Complete and utter disbelief. They had been expecting to see the Marines break under pressure, to see them fall apart when faced with a fierce night assault. But instead, they found themselves facing a force that stood its ground, took the hits, and then hit back harder. If you're thinking this is an incredible story, you're absolutely right. And if you want to keep hearing about these intense moments from history, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. The battle for Guadalcanal is just getting started, and there's so much more you won't want to miss. Click the button now so you don't miss out on the rest of the story. By the time the first counterattack was launched by the Marines, the Japanese were already reeling. More than 800 of their soldiers had been killed in a single night, and the rest of their forces weren't faring much better. The battle had turned into a one-sided massacre. The Marines weren't just holding their ground. They were pushing the Japanese back with precision and deadly force. The tanks rolled forward, with their guns firing relentlessly, clearing out the Japanese who had taken cover in the trees. It wasn't long before the Japanese soldiers began to realize just how far they were outgunned. American tanks, with their superior armor and firepower, were tearing through their lines with ease. As the sun rose, it became clear. The Japanese attack was not just stalled, it was a complete failure. But even as the Marines celebrated their hard-fought victory, there was no time to rest. The Japanese weren't going to give up easily. They had reinforcements coming, and they would be back soon to try again. The battle was far from over, and the Marines, despite their success, knew that the real fight was just beginning. At this point, the Japanese weren't just fighting the Americans, they were fighting the environment too. The jungle, which had once been a natural ally for the Japanese forces, had become a harsh, unforgiving opponent. The heat was suffocating, the humidity was unbearable, and the jungle itself seemed to conspire against the Japanese with mud, thick foliage, and terrain that made it impossible to move quickly or fight effectively. If you're still with me, you can already see how this battle is shaping up to be one of the most brutal and consequential of the Pacific War. Don't miss out on the next part, where we dive deeper into the next phase of this incredible campaign. But before we go there, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You'll be one of the first to hear all about the twists and turns that follow. We're just getting started, and I promise you won't want to miss a moment of it." As the battle continued, the Japanese forces kept throwing wave after wave of soldiers against the American defenses. But every time they charged, they were met with a hail of machine gun fire, artillery, and even air support. The Japanese couldn't even get close before they were cut down. It was like fighting against an invisible, impenetrable wall of firepower. They tried to use their superior tactics, their night skills, and their famous bayonets, but it was all for nothing. The American Marines weren't intimidated. They didn't fear the dark. They didn't fear the Japanese warrior spirit. They feared only the failure to do their job. And as they fought on, they proved that the American military machine could overcome even the toughest opponents. But despite the odds stacked against them, the Japanese were determined. They couldn't accept defeat. They had to try again, and they would. Before I go any further, hit that subscribe button if you're hooked on this story. The next part is about to get even more intense, and I don't want you to miss out. Trust me, you'll be glad you did. So, what happens when the next wave of reinforcements arrives? What will the Japanese do next? And how will the American forces continue to hold their ground? All of this is coming up, so stick with me. You won't want to miss it. By the time the Japanese reinforcements had arrived, the situation had already changed beyond recognition. The Marines were ready. They had dug in, prepared their defenses, and were expecting the next wave. But the Japanese didn't know what they were up against. The Marines had a new secret weapon, overwhelming firepower. What the Japanese believed to be a temporary setback was now the beginning of a complete disaster. The Japanese forces had been taught to believe in the invincibility of their warriors. They'd been trained to fight for the honor of their emperor, to charge into battle with unmatched courage and an unshakable will. But when they landed on Guadalcanal, they were met with something they had never encountered before. An enemy who didn't just fight, they fought smart, they fought together, and they fought with precision. And let's not forget the one thing the Japanese couldn't have foreseen: the American ability to adapt, to make the best use of whatever resources they had. They didn't have superior numbers, but they had superior organization and firepower. The Japanese didn't know how to respond to that. They had expected a traditional fight, but the Marines didn't play by those rules. They had systems, and those systems worked. So, what happens when you face an enemy that uses everything at their disposal? What happens when the balance of power isn't just about who has the most men or the best fighters, but about who has the best equipment, the best tactics, and the ability to call in support when needed? The Japanese forces learned that the hard way. They learned that American forces had the firepower to take down tanks, machine gun positions, and anything else they threw at them. And most importantly, they learned that American soldiers weren't afraid to die for their country. But they weren't about to die in vain now. If you're already feeling the intensity of this battle, don't go anywhere. Make sure you subscribe to this channel because the story is far from over. If you think this part is wild, just wait for the twists that are coming next. This is history, but it's not just about what happened, it's about how it happened. And I'm bringing you the full picture, with all the details you won't find anywhere else. So hit that subscribe button now because you don't want to miss what's coming up next. The Japanese response was swift and desperate. They had to take Henderson Field back. It was the key to everything. The key to the island, the key to their naval superiority, and the key to any hope of reclaiming the Pacific. But the Americans weren't about to give it up. They had already built a strong perimeter around Henderson Field. They had aircraft in the sky and artillery on the ground. They had everything they needed to hold their position. The Japanese would have to fight tooth and nail to take it back, and fight they did. On the night of September 12th, the Japanese launched a new assault, hoping to break through the American defenses. This time they had more men, more artillery, and more equipment. They were going to use everything they had to take back Henderson Field. But what they didn't realize was that the Marines were just as determined to keep it. The battle that ensued would go down in history as one of the most intense and brutal of the Pacific War. The Japanese forces tried to infiltrate through the jungle, using the cover of darkness to their advantage. But the Americans were ready. They had set up defensive positions with interlocking fields of fire. They knew exactly where the Japanese were likely to come from, and they had artillery and machine guns aimed at those exact spots. They were ready for the fight. And when the Japanese came, they were met with a hail of bullets, shells, and grenades. The Marines didn't just sit back and wait for the attack. They fought with everything they had. They fired back with machine guns, and when their guns ran dry, they grabbed rifles and kept shooting. The battle turned into a chaotic, savage struggle, soldiers fighting in the mud, in the jungle, in the darkness. But despite their best efforts, the Japanese couldn't break through. The American defenses held strong. By the end of the night, the Japanese forces had been devastated. The Marines had taken down wave after wave of attackers, and the Japanese were left with nothing but broken units and shattered morale. It was a crushing defeat for the Japanese and a monumental victory for the Marines. The Marines had shown the world that they could stand firm no matter the odds. They had proven that their tactical superiority, their firepower, and their unwavering will to win could overcome any challenge. And what did the Japanese forces do in the wake of this defeat? They regrouped. They licked their wounds, but they didn't give up. The next day they would be back. They would be back to fight for their honor, to fight for their emperor, and to fight to take back the land they had lost. But the Americans were ready for them. They had learned from the past, and they weren't going to make the same mistakes again. They were ready for the next wave. Now, I know you're probably thinking, this story sounds like a movie, right? But trust me, this is real history, and it's even more incredible when you know the full details. And if you want to dive even deeper into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button. I've got more stories coming your way, stories that will blow your mind. So don't wait, subscribe now and get ready for the next chapter. You won't regret it. As dawn broke on September 13th, the battlefield was eerily silent. The screams and gunfire from the previous night had faded, replaced with the stillness of the jungle and the unmistakable stench of gunpowder. The Marines had held their ground, but the Japanese weren't done yet. They had suffered a crushing defeat, but they still had the will to fight. For them, surrender was not an option. It was dishonor. But that morning, the Japanese survivors of the battle were faced with a grim realization. Their old tactics, the ones that had made them feared across Asia, were not working here. They had underestimated their enemy, and now they were paying the price. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for the soldiers on the front lines, but for their commanders as well. The reality was sinking in. The Americans weren't just a new opponent. They were an opponent unlike any the Japanese had ever encountered. The American Marines were fierce, yes, but it wasn't just their courage that made them formidable. It was their equipment, their firepower, and their ability to coordinate and adapt to every situation. For the Japanese forces, the idea that they could overwhelm the Americans with sheer numbers or their superior warrior spirit was shattered. They had learned, in the most brutal way, that war wasn't just about who was braver or who had the stronger spirit. It was about who had the better systems, the better coordination, and the better resources. And the Americans had all three. This realization would change the course of the war, not just on Guadalcanal but across the Pacific. The Japanese, once confident in their superiority, were now forced to rethink their strategy. Their logistics, their firepower, and their tactics all came into question. How could they continue fighting when their supplies were limited? Their forces were dwindling, and their old ways of combat had been proven ineffective. The Marines, on the other hand, had shown that the American system, built on industrial strength, logistics, and firepower, was the key to victory. The Japanese were learning the hard way that American might wasn't just a matter of numbers. It was a matter of organization, planning, and the ability to execute every phase of a campaign with devastating precision. But this battle wasn't over yet. The Japanese forces were still on the island, regrouping and preparing for another assault. Their numbers had been drastically reduced, but their fighting spirit remained. And despite the heavy losses they had suffered, they still believed they could turn the tide. The Marines, however, were no longer just defending. They were preparing for the next stage of the battle. They knew that their victory depended on holding the line, on keeping the Japanese from regaining their footing. But they also knew that they couldn't afford to get complacent. Every day the battle went on. The cost in lives and resources rose. But there was something else the Marines had learned. This wasn't just about holding ground. It was about making sure that they were prepared for anything the Japanese might throw at them. And the Japanese had learned the same lesson, albeit a painful one. They now understood that their old methods, their reliance on night raids and close combat, couldn't win the war against an enemy that could call in artillery, air support, and use coordinated attacks to break through defenses. Every time they tried to charge the Americans head-on, they were met with overwhelming firepower. Every time they tried to flank or infiltrate, they were met with well-prepared defensive positions that cut them down in waves. The Marines had learned how to fight in the jungle, how to use its dense foliage as cover, and how to exploit the Japanese weaknesses in coordination and logistics. The Japanese, for all their bravery, couldn't keep up with the pace of modern warfare. As the days turned into weeks, the Americans continued to build on their advantage. They didn't just sit back and wait. They adapted, they improved, and they executed their strategy with ruthless efficiency. The Japanese, on the other hand, found themselves stuck in a nightmare of attrition, fighting an enemy they couldn't understand, in an environment that worked against them at every turn. The jungle, which had once been a place of safety and cover, now worked in the Americans' favor. They knew the land, they knew how to use it, and they knew how to break the Japanese offensive at every step. And that's where we see the true difference between the two sides. The Japanese were fighting with courage, but they were lacking the key elements that would allow them to win a prolonged war: resources, logistics, and the ability to sustain their fighting forces. The Americans, despite their initial challenges, had the systems in place to overcome these issues. They had the support they needed to stay in the fight, to adapt their tactics, and to push forward. And every day they were making progress. If you're following along and feeling the intensity of this battle, remember to subscribe right now so you don't miss out on the full story. You're getting the inside look into how this conflict changed the entire trajectory of the war. Don't go anywhere, because we're just getting started, and trust me, the next parts of this story will keep you on the edge of your seat. As the Americans continued to push the Japanese forces back, they also faced a new challenge: the relentless heat, the humidity, and the diseases that spread through the jungle. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical ulcers had already taken a toll on both sides. But the Japanese were in far worse shape. Their supplies were limited and their morale was crumbling. As the battle for Guadalcanal stretched into its 6th month, the Japanese forces found themselves at their breaking point. The Marines had learned how to survive in the jungle, but the Japanese soldiers were barely hanging on. Their rations were gone, their medical supplies were non-existent, and their will to fight was waning. And yet, despite all these challenges, the Japanese still had one more card to play. They had learned from their past mistakes, and they were determined to give everything they had in a final push to take back the island. But as they launched their final offensive, they found themselves facing a Marine force that was stronger, more coordinated, and better equipped than they could have ever imagined. The stage was set for one last all-out assault, but before we dive into the final act of this brutal campaign, let me remind you once again to hit that subscribe button. The next chapter of this story is going to be explosive, and you're not going to want to miss it. The tide of battle is about to turn once again, and you'll want to see exactly how it all unfolds. So go ahead, subscribe now, and get ready for the next wave of action. As the battle raged on, something shifted in the hearts of the American forces. They weren't just defending now, they were pushing back with a newfound confidence. The brutal lessons they'd learned on Guadalcanal, the tactics, the strategy, and the sheer willpower to survive were beginning to pay off. The Marines and soldiers had become experts in jungle warfare. The challenges of the environment, the diseases, the constant threats from enemy forces, they all paled in comparison to the one unshakable truth. The Americans had learned how to fight through it all. They'd adapted, and now they were going to show the Japanese that the myth of their invincibility had been shattered. But the Japanese were not done. They weren't ready to concede defeat just yet. In fact, as the Americans pushed forward, the Japanese regrouped and prepared for another onslaught, driven by the same undying belief in their spiritual superiority. This time they weren't going to make the same mistake. They would push forward with overwhelming force with everything they had left. But what they didn't realize was that the Americans were no longer the same men who had arrived on Guadalcanal months before. These soldiers had become a unit, a force of nature that understood not just how to fight in the jungle, but how to outlast and outsmart their enemies at every turn. They had learned how to use the land, the resources, and the weapons at their disposal to their advantage. And more importantly, they had learned to survive no matter the odds. The next phase of the battle was intense, like a ticking time bomb. Both sides knew that the outcome of this conflict would not just shape Guadalcanal, it would define the Pacific War itself. For the Japanese, it was a last-ditch effort to retake the airfield and reclaim some semblance of honor. For the Americans, it was a fight to secure their first significant victory in the Pacific, a victory that would prove they could face down the might of the Japanese Empire and emerge victorious. The stakes could not have been higher. The Japanese forces, underestimating the Americans once again, launched their final assault. The sounds of marching feet, of voices shouting orders, and the screeching of artillery filled the jungle once more. It was chaos, pure and simple. The night was alive with the sounds of combat, but the Americans were ready. Their positions had been prepared with painstaking care, their defenses constructed in such a way that any frontal assault would be met with an overwhelming force. Machine guns were placed in perfect spots to deliver the deadliest firepower. Mortars were ready to unleash hell on any attempt to break through. The Marines knew their enemy's tactics well by now, and this time they weren't going to give them the satisfaction of breaking through. As the first wave of Japanese forces charged, they walked right into the trap. The machine guns roared to life, sending waves of Japanese soldiers to the ground. But the Japanese didn't stop. They were used to this, to charging through heavy fire, to pushing forward despite the carnage around them. However, what they hadn't accounted for was the American resolve. They thought they could break the Marines with sheer force, but what they were facing now was an opponent that had learned how to withstand, how to adapt, and how to hit back harder than ever before. For every soldier that fell, 10 more took their place, not just in numbers, but in skill. The Japanese, despite their courage and their relentless assault, couldn't break the American line. But this was not the end of the story. Despite their overwhelming losses, the Japanese were still determined. The final push had begun, but this time they were fighting a force that knew how to anticipate and counter every move. The tide was turning. The Japanese forces, in their desperation, threw everything they had at the Americans. But the Marines, now armed with experience and knowledge of their enemy's tactics, turned the tables. Their artillery, air support, and unshakable spirit kept pushing back the Japanese wave after wave. It was a turning point, and though the battle was far from over, the Japanese could feel it. Their defeat was inevitable. The realization that they were fighting a war they couldn't win had begun to sink in. The Japanese forces were trapped on the island, surrounded by Americans who not only controlled the skies, but had the ability to launch attacks on multiple fronts. The psychological toll was devastating. The realization that they could not outlast the Americans, that their fighting spirit, no matter how fierce, could not overcome the American machine, was a blow to the Japanese forces' morale that they could never recover from. But the final test was still to come. The Japanese still had one more trick up their sleeve. They planned to use their naval forces to support a massive evacuation. But even in this final desperate bid, the Japanese found themselves at odds with the sheer might of the American forces. The Navy, which had been the cornerstone of the Japanese strategy in the Pacific, was now outmatched by American naval superiority. The battle for Guadalcanal had escalated to a level no one had anticipated, and the American forces were proving time and time again that they could not only survive but dominate the battlefield. The next stage of the battle would determine the final outcome. For the Japanese, it was a race against time. For the Americans, it was a matter of holding their ground, maintaining their position and preparing for the final push that would force the Japanese off the island once and for all. Before we dive into the final act of this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button now. You don't want to miss the rest of the action. The final stages of this battle are coming up, and trust me, it's going to get even more intense. You're not going to want to miss what happens next, so hit that button and stay with us as we wrap up this epic story. By now, the Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were in a desperate struggle, trapped between dwindling resources and overwhelming American firepower. The battle, which had already been a grueling test of endurance and strength, was about to enter its final stages. What had started as an underestimation of American capabilities was quickly turning into a brutal lesson for the Imperial Japanese Army. They had come to Guadalcanal with supreme confidence, but now as the tide of the battle shifted, that confidence was rapidly crumbling. The Japanese soldiers, who had once believed in their invincibility, were now faced with the sobering reality that their tactics, honed in the jungles of China and Southeast Asia, had been ineffective against the well-organized, industrial-strength American forces. As the Marines had proven again and again, it wasn't just about courage and skill. It was about having the systems in place to support those qualities. And the Americans had everything: artillery that could hit targets with pinpoint precision, machine guns that could fire continuously, air support that ruled the skies, and, above all, a logistics network that kept supplies flowing even in the most dire circumstances. But despite the mounting evidence that they were losing, the Japanese didn't give up. They kept fighting, charging forward in waves, hoping that their sheer determination could break through. And in the chaos, a terrible irony began to unfold. The jungle that had once been their advantage, the dense, tangled wilderness they had used so effectively to launch surprise attacks, was now betraying them. The very environment they had hoped to dominate was becoming an insurmountable obstacle. The Americans had learned how to use it to their advantage, setting up ambushes and laying traps in the thick brush, drawing the Japanese into prepared killing zones. The jungle, once their ally, was now the Americans' greatest weapon. But it wasn't just the environment that was working against the Japanese. It was their own lack of resources. American forces, on the other hand, had become masters at exploiting their industrial might. While the Japanese had struggled with logistical nightmares, running low on food, ammunition, and medical supplies, the Americans were well stocked, and their supply chains were resilient. When one tank was destroyed, another took its place. When a soldier fell, he was quickly replaced. The Americans could replace what they lost faster than the Japanese could inflict damage. It was a brutal realization for the Japanese soldiers. They could no longer rely on their usual methods. They were facing an enemy that was not only better equipped, but also better prepared for the fight. As the battle continued to rage, the Japanese made one last push to retake Henderson Field. The strategic importance of the airfield could not be overstated. Whoever controlled the field controlled the skies, and whoever controlled the skies controlled the sea. But the American hold on Henderson was unshakable. Even as Japanese forces launched wave after wave of attacks, they found themselves locked in an increasingly hopeless struggle. They had underestimated the American resilience, and now they were paying the price. And yet, even as their position grew more desperate, the Japanese forces were determined to keep fighting. They launched coordinated attacks from multiple directions, hoping to break the American line. But again, they were met with the same result: concentrated American firepower and well-coordinated defenses. The Japanese soldiers pushed forward with their usual bravery, but their attacks were ineffective against the overwhelming firepower and unyielding resolve of the American forces. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered, and as the battle wore on, the Japanese soldiers were forced to confront the reality of their situation. By now, American forces had not only proven their tactical superiority, but they had also demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of their combined arms approach: artillery, machine guns, air support, and infantry, all working together in perfect synchronization. The Japanese had no answer to this level of coordination, and with each failed assault, their morale plummeted further. As the days dragged on, the Japanese forces were slowly but surely worn down. The relentless American pressure had finally broken their will to fight. The once proud soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army were now demoralized, starving, and exhausted. They had no choice but to begin retreating, abandoning the island that had been the site of so many desperate battles. The final evacuation was a last-ditch effort to save what remained of the Japanese forces, but it was clear that the tide had turned irreversibly in favor of the Americans. But even as the Japanese retreated, the psychological impact of Guadalcanal was far from over. The realization that they had lost, that their tactical doctrines had failed them, was a blow to their morale that would take years to overcome. For the Japanese soldiers who had survived, Guadalcanal marked a turning point, a moment when the belief in their invincibility was replaced by the harsh reality that they could be defeated. And as the Japanese retreated into the jungle, the American forces stood firm, victorious. But the cost of victory had been high. The battle for Guadalcanal had claimed thousands of lives on both sides, and the wounds of war would linger long after the fighting stopped. The Americans had won, but they had learned valuable lessons about the true nature of war, about the importance of logistics, firepower, and coordination, and about the brutal reality of jungle warfare. As the Japanese retreated, the final stage of the campaign was about to unfold. The Americans, now in control of the island, would begin the long process of rebuilding and preparing for the next phase of the war in the Pacific. But the battle for Guadalcanal would remain a defining moment in the history of World War II, a testament to the resilience of the American forces and the harsh reality of jungle warfare. Before we dive into the final stages of the battle, hit that subscribe button now. You don't want to miss the gripping conclusion of this story. The final moments of the campaign are just around the corner, and trust me, you're not going to want to miss how it all ends. Subscribe now, stay with us, and let's finish this journey together. As the Japanese forces began their retreat, the final chapter of the Guadalcanal campaign unfolded. The island, now firmly in American hands, would become a pivotal turning point in the Pacific War. For the soldiers who fought on both sides, Guadalcanal had left a lasting imprint. On the American side, victory was not just a matter of holding the island. It was a powerful statement about the power of American logistics, firepower, and strategic coordination. For the Japanese, it was a devastating defeat, one that would haunt their military leaders and soldiers for the rest of the war. The Americans had not just held their ground. They had proven that the Japanese could be beaten in conventional warfare. No longer would the myth of Japanese invincibility persist. The American forces had demonstrated that their superior resources, coordination, and ingenuity could overpower even the most determined and disciplined adversaries. The American soldiers, who had initially arrived with a sense of uncertainty, were now battle-hardened veterans. They had learned the true value of preparation, unity, and the incredible power of industrial strength. They fought not just for survival, but with a new sense of confidence that would carry them through future battles. But while the Americans celebrated their hard-fought victory, the cost had been immense. Thousands of soldiers on both sides had given their lives, and the wounds of war would last long after the battle ended. The horrors of jungle combat, malaria, disease, starvation, and the constant threat of death had scarred the survivors. The gruesome sights of the battlefield, the unrelenting heat, and the crushing weight of loss were forever etched into their minds. For the men who had survived, Guadalcanal would never be just another battle. It was a brutal and unforgiving crucible that tested everything they thought they knew about war. As the battle continued to rage, the Japanese made one last push to retake Henderson Field. The strategic importance of the airfield could not be overstated. Whoever controlled the field controlled the skies, and whoever controlled the skies controlled the sea. But the American hold on Henderson was unshakable. Even as Japanese forces launched wave after wave of attacks, they found themselves locked in an increasingly hopeless struggle. They had underestimated the American resilience, and now they were paying the price. And yet, even as their position grew more desperate, the Japanese forces were determined to keep fighting. They launched coordinated attacks from multiple directions, hoping to break the American line. But again, they were met with the same result: concentrated American firepower and well-coordinated defenses. The Japanese soldiers pushed forward with their usual bravery, but their attacks were ineffective against the overwhelming firepower and unyielding resolve of the American forces. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered, and as the battle wore on, the Japanese soldiers were forced to confront the reality of their situation. By now, American forces had not only proven their tactical superiority, but they had also demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of their combined arms approach: artillery, machine guns, air support, and infantry, all working together in perfect synchronization. The Japanese had no answer to this level of coordination, and with each failed assault, their morale plummeted further. As the days dragged on, the Japanese forces were slowly but surely worn down. The relentless American pressure had finally broken their will to fight. The once proud soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army were now demoralized, starving, and exhausted. They had no choice but to begin retreating, abandoning the island that had been the site of so many desperate battles. The final evacuation was a last-ditch effort to save what remained of the Japanese forces, but it was clear that the tide had turned irreversibly in favor of the Americans. But even as the Japanese retreated, the psychological impact of Guadalcanal was far from over. The realization that they had lost, that their tactical doctrines had failed them, was a blow to their morale that would take years to overcome. For the Japanese soldiers who had survived, Guadalcanal marked a turning point, a moment when the belief in their invincibility was replaced by the harsh reality that they could be defeated. And as the Japanese retreated into the jungle, the American forces stood firm, victorious. But the cost of victory had been high. The battle for Guadalcanal had claimed thousands of lives on both sides, and the wounds of war would linger long after the fighting stopped. The Americans had won, but they had learned valuable lessons about the true nature of war, about the importance of logistics, firepower, and coordination, and about the brutal reality of jungle warfare. As the Japanese retreated, the final stage of the campaign was about to unfold. The Americans, now in control of the island, would begin the long process of rebuilding and preparing for the next phase of the war in the Pacific. But the battle for Guadalcanal would remain a defining moment in the history of World War II, a testament to the resilience of the American forces and the harsh reality of jungle warfare. Before we dive into the final stages of the battle, hit that subscribe button now. You don't want to miss the gripping conclusion of this story. The final moments of the campaign are just around the corner, and trust me, you're not going to want to miss how it all ends. Subscribe now, stay with us, and let's finish this journey together. As the Japanese forces began their retreat, the final chapter of the Guadalcanal campaign unfolded. The island, now firmly in American hands, would become a pivotal turning point in the Pacific War. For the soldiers who fought on both sides, Guadalcanal had left a lasting imprint. On the American side, victory was not just a matter of holding the island. It was a powerful statement about the power of American logistics, firepower, and strategic coordination. For the Japanese, it was a devastating defeat, one that would haunt their military leaders and soldiers for the rest of the war. The Americans had not just held their ground. They had proven that the Japanese could be beaten in conventional warfare. No longer would the myth of Japanese invincibility persist. The American forces had demonstrated that their superior resources, coordination, and ingenuity could overpower even the most determined and disciplined adversaries. The American soldiers, who had initially arrived with a sense of uncertainty, were now battle-hardened veterans. They had learned the true value of preparation, unity, and the incredible power of industrial strength. They fought not just for survival, but with a new sense of confidence that would carry them through future battles. But while the Americans celebrated their hard-fought victory, the cost had been immense. Thousands of soldiers on both sides had given their lives, and the wounds of war would last long after the battle ended. The horrors of jungle combat, malaria, disease, starvation, and the constant threat of death had scarred the survivors. The gruesome sights of the battlefield, the unrelenting heat, and the crushing weight of loss were forever etched into their minds. For the men who had survived, Guadalcanal would never be just another battle. It was a brutal and unforgiving crucible that tested everything they thought they knew about war. As the Japanese forces evacuated, the psychological toll on their soldiers was immeasurable. The defeat was not just a loss of men and equipment, but a crushing blow to their morale and to the ideology they had fought to protect. The realization that the Americans had outlasted them, had held firm against everything the Japanese threw at them, was a bitter pill to swallow. And while the Japanese would continue to fight for years, Guadalcanal had shattered the illusion of their invincibility. Their tactical doctrines, which had served them so well in previous campaigns, had failed. The jungle that had once been their advantage had betrayed them. They were no longer the unstoppable force they had believed themselves to be. But despite the devastation, the Japanese would not give up. Their soldiers, despite their hunger, exhaustion, and sickness, remained fiercely determined. They had been taught to never retreat, to fight until the end. But for the men who had survived, the reality of the situation was sinking in. They had faced the unimaginable, and now they knew that the war was far from over. The struggle for Guadalcanal had drained them, both physically and mentally, but it was also a moment of transformation. They had learned the hard way that no matter how much courage you have, without the necessary support, without logistics, without resources, even the most skilled warriors will eventually be defeated. As the campaign wound down, the Japanese forces, already weakened by disease and starvation, were forced to evacuate the island. But the damage had been done. Guadalcanal had been a devastating loss, and the consequences of that defeat would echo throughout the Pacific theater for the rest of the war. The Japanese military would struggle to recover from the massive losses in both men and morale. And as for the Americans, they knew they had won a critical battle, but they were also keenly aware that this victory came at a high cost. The lessons learned on Guadalcanal would shape every operation from that point on. For the Americans, Guadalcanal marked the beginning of the end for Japanese expansion in the Pacific. It was a hard-won victory, but it set the stage for the relentless American offensive that would sweep across the Pacific Islands, culminating in the eventual defeat of Japan. The battle had proven that American industrial might, when combined with tactical competence and unwavering resolve, could overcome the challenges posed by even the most formidable opponents. And while the battle for Guadalcanal may have ended in February 1943, its significance reverberated far beyond the island itself. It was a turning point that reshaped the course of the war, a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of the American fighting man. As the Americans held the island, they cemented their place in the Pacific as a dominant force, one that would push forward relentlessly until victory was secured. As we reflect on the lessons of Guadalcanal, it's clear that the battle was about more than just strategy and tactics. It was about the human spirit, the will to survive, and the ability to adapt in the face of overwhelming adversity. Both sides endured unimaginable hardships, and both learned invaluable lessons that would shape the outcome of the war. But in the end, it was the Americans who emerged victorious, thanks to their superior resources, logistics, and firepower. Now that you know the story behind this legendary battle, hit that subscribe button. The story of Guadalcanal is one of many pivotal moments in history, and we have countless more to share with you. Stay tuned for more gripping stories and don't miss out on future videos that break down history's most important events. You'll be the first to know when we release new content, so subscribe now and be part of this incredible journey.